I'll start to kick off the session. So, yeah, morning everybody. Thank you for joining us for our How to Successfully Migrate to SharePoint Online session. My name's Zopash Iqbal and I'm on the marketing team here. So there's just a couple of things to go over before we get started. So the session is being recorded. So just so that you're aware, and we'll be sending a copy of the recording out after the event. So if there is anything that you maybe want to catch up on or anything that you might have missed or you want to share with somebody else in your teams, you can do. You are on mute at the minute as well, but we encourage you to use the chat function to ask any questions, and we will do our best to get them answered throughout the session. We do have a dedicated kind of Q&A at the end of the session as well, so we just encourage you to get as many questions regarding SharePoint into the chat as possible. We'll do our best to answer them for you. So yeah, that's the kind of main points covered. So what I'll do now is I'm going to pass you on to our team of experts led by our Head of Modern Workplace, Graham McLean. And we also have our experts, Alex Innes and Ollie Wakefield, who are on today as well, and they'll be guiding you through the session. So I'm going to hand you over to Graham just now, and we hope you find the session useful, and we hope you enjoy. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks Zopash. Morning everyone. Let's just kick off with the agenda. So just, yeah, as Zopash had mentioned, I'm going to take you through the kind of initial kind of first few slides. I'm also joined by two of my team, Ollie and Alex, and they're going to take you through some of the different sections as well. So today what we're going to go through is we're going to go through some introductions, just in terms of, you know, setting the scene for SharePoint migration. You know, how do you get started? What are the things that you need to have a look at up front, and then have a look at planning, and just, you know, what should you consider? What do you need to kind of have in place before you actually start doing anything? We're going to have a look at some best practices. So what kind of guidelines and rules should you be conforming to? And then we're going to really look at the security and compliance features as well. So really a bit of a kind of addition, if you like, but just things that you should maybe consider as you migrate, so that you could do a future step of work to kind of bolster the security and compliance area. As Zopash said, if you've got any questions on the way through, then feel free to put them in the chat window. We'll also pick up any questions at the end if we've got time in the Q&A section. So before we jump into the agenda, I've just got a few slides that just explain Bridgel for those that haven't been on any events before, and then we'll get started into the main topic. So for those of you that haven't been on before, Bridgel are based in Glasgow. We have 40 staff at the moment and growing. We were established in 2002, actually towards the end of 2002, so we're celebrating 20 years this year. We work across a number of different pillars. So we have the Modern Intelligent Workplace team, which I head up, and Alex and Ollie are in my team. And that looks after kind of SharePoint, Power Platform, Dynamics 365. So most of the kind of Microsoft platform space, if you like. We then have the Managed IT Services and Support section, which look after all the kind of infrastructure, hardware, supporting the kind of day-to-day IT needs of the business, and also looking at kind of further strategy as well. And analytics and applications, so looking at kind of big data platform, and looking at custom build applications as well. And we have a product in the water space for billing and for settlement charges, so quite a specific product, but that's one of our offerings as well. So across all those kind of pillars, if you like, we review and advise on the best options for you. We can help you implement the best and most kind of cost-effective solutions, and we provide ongoing IT solution support as part of that as well. We're a Microsoft partner, so we're 10 times Microsoft Gold partner. We're also one of Microsoft's content services preferred partners. We're one of 26 worldwide. And what that does is that gives us exclusive kind of access to some of the Microsoft engineering team in Redmond, and also being able to look earlier in the roadmap and see what's coming up, what's new, and lets us get kind of hands-on new features earlier than other Microsoft partners. We're also ISO 27001 and ISO 9001 certified, and we've had that certification for a number of years and been renewed a number of times. This kind of selection of our customers is really to show, we work across private and public sectors, across a number of different industry verticals. So you'll see some familiar faces here, hopefully, manufacturing, housing, national government, NHS, utilities, etc. So that's really the kind of upfront background bit, if you like. I'll hand over to Ollie and let him take you through the kind of main event, as it were.
Hi there, I'm Ollie Wakefield, I'm SharePoint consultant at Bridgewell. Jump through to the next slide. So we're going to look now at some of the sort of use cases of why you would want to migrate to SharePoint, specifically to SharePoint Online. Let's give you a bit of context on SharePoint to start with. So SharePoint's a web collaboration system launched in 2001. You'll probably be familiar, there's been quite a few versions over the years, common still in support, 2013, 2016 and 2019 on-premises. And a very common use case is for on-premises to be moved to SharePoint Online, which is part of the Microsoft 365 platform. So, a lot of companies are still using on-prem for multiple reasons, but we really encourage now to move to online because there's huge benefits. You've also got facts that say, for example, SharePoint 2013 is coming towards the end of its life in April. And what would you use SharePoint for? So it's grown hugely what SharePoint was used for over the years. But at the basic level, you've got document management, you've got database management, like kind of using lists and libraries. You've got an intranet. And you've got kind of a shared drive system, and combining with all that as version control and search. So why would you want to migrate? So some of the common reasons are here. So you've got your business is restructuring, there's a company refresh, mergers and acquisitions. As we mentioned before, for example, with SharePoint 2013 coming to the end of life, it's no longer in support. And probably one of the biggest ones is to get to Microsoft 365 benefits, because Microsoft really has put their money and time into the online package, and on-prem is more of a keep it going, really, rather than being heavily feature filled these days. So migrating SharePoint can be quite a painful business. So there's often some common issues that come up or mistakes. So one of the first ones is not having any governance, and this is both starts from the source, where the source site can be heavily ungoverned, making it difficult to migrate, moving to the destination where some of those bad practices can be carried over. So it's always important to try and get some sort of governance in place before you move, so you don't kind of continue the same errors. Using the wrong migration tool, picking one that's inappropriate, too lightweight, or too expensive. Failing to manage change management. At the end of the day, people are always involved in migrations, and if they're not aware of what's happening or are not pre-prepped, it can be very painful for them, and also can, in the worst case scenario, lead to a failure of adoption. Using SharePoint as a replacement for a network file share, there's often kind of a case where SharePoint, the end user will barely actually see the SharePoint front end and will just be using it kind of as a glorified file share. And often this means that users don't get the benefits of SharePoint, or the versioning and kind of content management tools that you get in there. Very common one was back in the sort of, let's say, 2010s era, there was a real focus on beefing up SharePoint to make it a master of everything, and as a result, master of none by using custom solutions. This kind of led to like having lots of third-party apps all over your SharePoint that often run out of support, causing expensive bills to replace. If you move to online now, what happens is that there's lots of different apps that will kind of cover these different solutions rather than it all being focused on SharePoint. So SharePoint only becomes part of the wider Microsoft 365 picture. And then you've also got, and to roll on from that, you've got SharePoint as a single operating service within Microsoft 365, which basically SharePoint is no longer just a silo by itself. It works alongside other things like Power Apps, Power Automate, Power BI. So how you plan your migration then? So first of all, you'd look at what tool to use. So on a kind of basic level, you can do a lift and shift. You download your information, you re-upload it to SharePoint Online. This is can work, but is often going to cause a fair bit of rework to need to be done. It might mean users lose permissions or lose metadata. So we probably wouldn't recommend to do that unless you've got a very small amount of information to move. Microsoft provides a free migration tool called the SharePoint Migration Tool, and this is good for, as I say, a medium or small size scenario, but it has some limitations. It's relatively bare bones. We would probably recommend in most cases to use something like ShareGate, and there's some other competitors as well. But this tool allows you to kind of do a lot of like pre-work reporting before you migrate, and there's lots of very kind of powerful technical tools to migrate over, including things like mapping and permissions moves. See if there's any questions in the chat. Okay. ShareGate really is a good tool, but it's also important to remember that's set up correctly with enough resources before you start your migration, because it can be quite intensive both on the source system, as in you're originating SharePoint or whatever system you're using. So you don't want to form bottlenecks in that fashion. Okay, so there's quite a few steps before you even migrate. Sorry, I think we've got a question there. Yeah, just to answer that one, James, yes, it does bring over the dates and original metadata, so you will see that. So planning your migration, then there's quite a few steps, 1 to 7. Migration is only one part of this. So first of all, you've got the pre-migration. This is kind of like the pre-planning stage. You've got quite a few different approaches. A big bang, take everything over at once, can be a bit difficult, especially with user adoption. Taking a staged approach, e.g. department by department, and then obviously look at your tooling, which we just had a look at. Really need to work with the business there to work out what's an appropriate amount of data to take over in each kind of tranche, as it were, or section. So you can kind of like, okay, this business area has come over, we're all ready, and then we completed that migration, we're happy that they're on board, and then we move on to the next. Discovery. So this is basically doing a big look at what you've already got in your original environment, on-prem, SharePoint, or other tool. So it gives you a good list. You want to get a list of sites, SharePoint lists and libraries, users, permissions, everything you can, and more information you have, the easier it will be. And there's lots of SharePoint tools like PowerShell to help you get that information. Then you've got the cleanup stage. So the more you get rid of, the less you have to carry over. So we always encourage a business to try and, at the very least, leave some stuff behind to then be decommed afterwards. You don't need to take everything over. This is kind of it's often a good opportunity to clean house and go, it's very difficult, I know, these days to not kind of carry every bit of data you've ever made with you for compliance reasons, etc. But you don't need to keep everything usually, and it will speed up and reduce costs if you clean up. So you want to prepare your new environment, so make sure an Office 365 tenant is in place. This is the most common scenario to move to 365, and make sure there's licensing in place, because if users don't have the right licenses, they might not have the right experience when they get over. We often sort of recommend some of the enterprise licenses depending on what you need, but there are cheaper licenses available. Preparing your user base, so you want to ensure the users understand what's going to happen. They've got appropriate training, and Microsoft provides loads and loads of training. You don't necessarily, on their website, you don't necessarily need to buy bespoke materials. It's really well supported with videos and text training, but it's really going to depend on your user base and what they're doing. So making sure that there's sessions ahead of time really helps. And then sort of, not finally, but the sort of main part after all this pre-prep is to actually migrate the data using the tool. So probably in stages, giving regular updates to everyone as it's going on. And then you've got the service adoption. So you obviously want to be testing during the process, making sure that that there's reports run in tools like ShareGate to see if there's any errors, but also to get some end users testing before the go live. Sometimes we kind of have an incremental migration as well to once the testing's taken place, to kind of bring over the final changes. So for go live. Just to say there as well, Microsoft provides kind of a whole section on adoption on its website, so that's worth looking at. There we go. Graham's just linked that down there on the chat below. So best practices when migrating to SharePoint Online. So here's a couple. Don't lift and shift. I think we kind of alluded to that earlier, but make sure that you're spending time kind of getting the SharePoint Online environment ready to be used as successfully. It might not be its full capacity. There might be extra tools you want to use, but you don't want the end user on day one to go, oh, this 365 tools are a load of rubbish because I can't do anything that I used to be able to do. So a bit of finessing to make sure that it's a good, if not slightly bare bones environment when you start, is really important. Making decisions based on your data is partly why the discovery is so important. What have you got? Is there any data that's going to cause issues with the migration? Large file sizes, large libraries, and kind of make decisions based on that. Also, just look at what can be left behind as well. Focus on the user training. It really, at the end of the day, this is all about the user. If they don't like this will cause pain for them. Whatever you do, there's always going to be a slightly painful process to migrate, and it's often not in the best short-term interests for the user to migrate. They'll be like, "Why are you doing this? This isn't what I need today. I've got other things to do." But if you try and work with them and bring them along with you, you're going to have a much better adoption process. Look at the new features of SharePoint Online and Microsoft 365. A lot of what you were probably doing on-prem can be done more cheaply, better, and much more user-friendly fashion in 365. So sometimes it's not worth taking things over exactly as they were. Have a look at what new features there are. I mean, for example, there's a lot of workflows in SharePoint using SharePoint 2013 workflow. Power Automate is a great replacement for that, and it might be better rather than just taking over those 2013 workflows, rebuilding them in the new system. And then have a look at the wider Microsoft stack. There's, as I say, SharePoint's only one part of the infrastructure now, so you may have been trying to do some reports in SharePoint before in a country, maybe using Excel exports, but now there's Power BI to bring your collaborative working to a new level. Okay, so we're just going to look on to controlling SharePoint creation. So this is when you're bringing over and starting afresh in 365, you really want to stop it kind of becoming a bit of a jungle, as it were, as things are created without any governance. So you might want to put some restrictions on site creation, naming conventions, and that sort of thing, and using some tools to kind of manage that, picking up data from the business. So for example, if there's a new site, you can just bring up an MS form. This is the department, this is the justification, a Power Automate flow for an approval. So because one of the common scenarios we have, especially in the pandemic, was people getting 365, nice new collaborative tool, and essentially just going nuts on Teams, building endless team sites, which is great for kind of internal small term collaboration, but kind of creates a bit of a governance nightmare when you're trying to bring your intranet under a bit more control. Then we'll look at kind of governance generally. So as I say, get the rules in place from the start before you migrate. So even though you might not have the full works, it's worth getting at least a document down of what the rules are for users to adopt, even if some of those more technical governance tools, which Alex will allude to later, aren't yet in place. Really kind of work out how you're going to manage Teams, because Teams is really fundamental now. I'd say Microsoft's really pushed Teams. SharePoint is kind of, you think, walking into the background a little bit, and Teams is really the front end for your users. So really needs to think how that works, especially things like guest sharing. It's such a powerful tool, but can be, if not misused, inconsistently used by the business. It's really important to designate owners for each business area. It's best that the SharePoint administrator is essentially doing minimal day-to-day work in each site. Really, it's for the owners of the sites to kind of generate content and manage that. If that model is instilled early, that's going to take a lot of pain from your IT team. And also permissions are really key, because the out-of-the-box permissions in SharePoint on-prem are quite different than the model that's used in 365. It tends to be only 3 groups in a 365 site: an owner, a member, and a visitor, and you don't want to break that inheritance multiple times, which is often the case in on-prem SharePoint, where we have really messy permissions often. There's kind of a new paradigm to keep it simple. Every site you can instantly see who's got access. Also, I've got a little look here about classic and modern. So SharePoint 2016 and 2019 allow for the modern look and feel, but the older versions of SharePoint 2013 and backwards use what's called the classic look. Now, SharePoint Online supports both modern and classic, but really you always want to go for modern if you can, because classic will be eventually deprecated. So you don't want to bring over classic material if you can, maybe only archive sites, for example, but you want to make sure you're trying to maximize the use of modern where you are. But there's huge amount of benefits to it as a layer. It's much more user friendly and is much better for search, for example. But it's just being aware of it with your migration, because you can bring up quite a few classic elements, but you might not necessarily want to bring over. And ShareGate will help you kind of, as a tool, for example, will help you avoid that. The other thing to really look at is hubs. So in classic SharePoint on-prem, you'd often have a site collection, which is like a top-level site with lots of sub-sites sitting underneath in a tree. And that's all well and good, but when it comes to business restructure, it becomes a bit of a nightmare, as you have to try and move sites between different departments, and it's not designed to work that way. So business restructures became incredibly painful on premises. When your SharePoint Online has a massively useful feature called hubs, where essentially you're associating sites with a hub site which is designated, but very quickly and easily you can move a site from being from one hub to the other without any kind of direct inheritance. So it works for search and navigation as well, and it basically is like kind of where you should start when structuring your new SharePoint Online environment for the migration. Really powerful, and we definitely recommend you do that. In short, you probably never need to build a sub-site again. And then we've already talked about permissions a little bit, but you want to have very clear permissions. Focus on the group model, having an owner group for managing the site, member for editing, and a visitor group for read only. And you want to have a look at the idea of least access. We're living in an increasingly insecure world, lots of threats. So you want to use the least access principle, which is when accessing a site, only those who need it have access, no one else. And you can also use permissions to search across all associated sites. So if you set permissions up right, people's search is going to be a lot better, because they're not going to get back anything that they don't need to see. So if you've got the hub structure and the search right, that's half your hub structure and permissions right, that's half your search setup done. Okay, that's me then. So we'll pass you over to Alex now for the security and compliance features. I'm just going to have a look at some questions before we move on. Sorry, I'm a little bit behind there. Okay, so we've got from Stephen. I'm coming from a mixture of Google Workspace and on-prem. That's quite, yeah, that's a very common scenario.
Yeah, it's okay, Ollie. I'm kind of working my way through those ones. So
okay, no problem. I'll pass over to Alex. Yeah, no worries.
Hi everyone, I'm Alex. I'll be talking about the security and compliance features of SharePoint Online. As Ollie kind of alluded to before this, they're probably not the kind of #1 hitters of what you're doing your migration for, but they're definitely aspects to consider as your migration as a whole, as they do bring some important features to SharePoint. Kind of, I'll also get to in the slides on kind of why they're aspects to consider. So the first one to look at is retention. So Microsoft offer retention over quite a few of their applications. So SharePoint documents and lists, your team documents, the team chats, and in email as well. How retention works is you can build a number of retention labels and say this label, I want to keep these tagged data for say 1 year, and after that 1 year, you can have an action at the end. So that's delete, or so that's review, or now what SharePoint has, or kind of Microsoft 365 has brought in, is now at the end of a retention policy, you can run a Power Automate flow, which gives you a huge amount of flexibility on what can happen to that file at the end of its retention. Retention is built off triggers. Currently, there's actually only really kind of 3 triggers, or 3 main triggers that we'll look at. So when the document was created, or the item was created, when the item was modified, or when the item was labeled. With the retention, as I kind of mentioned, it's a kind of a labeling policy. You go through and you label your files or groups of files with these labels, and then it will follow the retention that's based on that label. You can also build in, you can look at reporting for retention. So as I kind of mentioned on the slide there's a wee graph. You can see how many files and what files are tagged with your retention policies. The retention policies are, as I said, it's not an essential aspect of your migration, but you're already looking at your data as part of your migration. So you should probably look at, well, what happens to my data if you're just moving data into SharePoint Online and leaving it to sit? It's gonna sit, and it'll sit there forever if no one looks at it. But if you take that time and look at retention and kind of build those retention policies in, you're kind of cleansing your data automatically, or forcing to review your data automatically. It's no longer a kind of manual step. If you look at it at kind of the start of migration or part of that migration, then it kind of handles itself if it's all clearly tagged. Moving on for retention. Got sensitivity labels. Sensitivity labels are similar kind of aspect to retention. It's a label that you apply to your data, but they work slightly differently. So sensitivity labels, again, they span across a number of services within Microsoft, so your Teams, SharePoint, Power BI, and emails. How sensitivity labels work is you create a label. So say, for example, you want to create a confidential label. What you can do with that confidential label is tag documents with that confidentiality label. Labels have rules and conditions associated to them. So what you can do with that confidential label is say, I don't want any document or item that's tagged with that confidential label to be able to leave the tenant. So that means if someone grabs that document from SharePoint, for example, and tries to email that out to a third party, at the point of email, it will block saying you're not allowed to email that document out. It contains sensitive or confidential information. And there's a whole host of rules you can build around your labels. You can have multiple labels kind of spanning from like typical use cases are internal, public, confidential, and kind of private. Kind of typical sensitivity labels that can be set up. Your labels can also go hand in hand with conditional access policies. So say what you could do, again, take an example of this confidential label. You can say, actually, well, we don't want anyone on a non-corporate device viewing confidential data. So you can tie that in with your conditional access, say like anyone who's not on a corporate or kind of authenticated device can't open a confidential document. So you're mitigating that kind of leak of information outside of your tenant. And again, in terms of bringing that back to migration, it's maybe not number one on your hit list for migration. You want to pull your data across. If it's something that you consider as part of the migration, you're already reviewing your data. So why don't you take it that step further to say, well, right, how do I prevent kind of data leakage outside of the tenant? These things can be set up, and it might actually influence on where some data is kept or how some data is stored in, say, SharePoint. So moving on from sensitivity labels, as we're talking about data, let's talk a wee bit about e-discovery. So e-discovery, as it says, it's a discovery of content inside your tenant. It can look across Teams, SharePoint, and emails. It's mainly used for kind of gather evidence in legal cases, but it gives you tools to kind of search across your tenant. There are two levels to your e-discovery. You've got e-discovery standard and e-discovery premium. E-discovery standard gives you the tools for that searching and kind of gathering data and kind of cases. The searching is kind of keyhold and keyword queries, and you can build search conditions, and then you can export that information. Also gives you the ability in the standard kind of licensing to have role-based permissions. So you might want to split out how your kind of workflow of how you're searching for this content. So you might want to split out to say, oh, I want X number of users to be able to build like the keyword queries or the kind of search terms, but I don't want them to be able to actually view the data. So you can split those out in permissions, different permission levels to say kind of like querier and then reviewer. Premium gives you those features and some kind of nice to haves on top of that. One really handy one that eDiscovery has for its kind of premium features is it does an automatic cull of duplicate data sets in your results. So say you search across SharePoint for documents containing X, and it brings back 5 of the same document, it'll automatically cull 4 of them and just leave you with 1 with that data. So it means that your resultant set of data is a lot smaller and it's a lot easier to review. eDiscovery also has features to allow you to search external to the Microsoft environment as well with some data connectors. You can connect into say you have a corporate SharePoint or kind of LinkedIn. You can actually incorporate those as part of eDiscoveries if you're using data connectors, which is handy if say you have like a corporate LinkedIn page. You might want to be able to search in the content of that as well. So it can stretch a bit further out of its own tenant. Microsoft have also, I say fairly recently in the last year, have released a kind of newer product called Privia. which is more focused on things like subject GDPR requests and that aspect of things. There's kind of two offerings inside the Privia, which is your privacy risk management, which will review the data that you're holding in your different environments, so your SharePoint, your teams, and it has kind of policy templates to help you reduce risk of kind of personal documents being stored in there and tell you where potential risks are around your environment. The kind of second offering, or the other part to that, is your subject rights requests, which you have provides automation and workflow tools for fulfilling like GDPR requests or the aspects. So it's really handy if you really want to dig into GDPR and how you're storing data. Bringing that all back into why that's something to consider for migration is that it might shape how you store your information inside SharePoint. As you're reviewing your data, you might want to say, well, actually, where am I storing my sensitive or private documents? Are they just sitting inside your HR department of SharePoint, or is that data duplicated between HR and say finance? So you might want to consider, well, actually, I'm storing quite a lot of sensitive data in HR, but also in finance. But you might want to change how that looks, or maybe combine the areas. But it might give you some thoughts on how you do your migration, or where those documents are stored. And talking about sensitive information and kind of GDPR, a common request as part of some of the SharePoint migration work we do is looking at subject access requests. If we're moving say we're moving from an older version of SharePoint to a newer version of SharePoint, how do we facilitate our subject access requests? Again, as previously mentioned in the slide, you could use tools such as Privia or your e-discovery to find that information and provide it to the user who's asking. But it's a workflow that probably should be considered in your migration step, to say, well, actually, if I do have to deal with subject access requests, it might influence how I'm migrating my private or sensitive information over to SharePoint. So it's something to consider when you're doing migrations. So that's when you got to the end of the bit about security and compliance features of SharePoint. I'm now going to move on to a few use cases of SharePoint migrations that we've done, and talk about the kind of issues that we had there, the challenges we had, and how we resolved them, and the kind of steps we did to resolve them. So first use case we have is between Link and Weslow. Link's a long-standing customer of ours. They bought over Weslow Housing, and they wanted to integrate the kind of Weslow SharePoint and Teams email and a file share into the Link environment. So that was the challenge. We had to integrate two tenants into one, and it was two Office 365 tenants merging into one tenant. Looking at some of the information that Ollie provided in previous slides, the approach that we took was a kind of big bang approach. Weslow didn't have a huge amount of information with them, so how we planned out our migration was that we did a alpha migration of most of their data over into the Link tenant, meaning that we can do this ahead of time. It doesn't affect any current operations, and we've got most of the data over into the Link tenant, and then we can just keep doing smaller incremental migrations over into Link to keep that data up to date. We then planned a cutover date to say, on this date we will kind of move the live systems from the Weslow tenant into the Link tenant. Planning is really key around doing a cutover date, because on that date you don't want to have any surprises. So you really want to plan out to say, right, what needs to happen on this date, and who's performing those actions. So we had a number of Bridgel staff working to kind of move over the emails, SharePoint, and data. In terms of the actual of how the data was structured, it was a fairly simple, that there wasn't any kind of SharePoint restructure. It was a case of we're moving these sites over into LinkedIn, and so that was fairly straightforward. But one of the kind of key aspects of that was planning that cutover date. So that migration was really successful. We got fantastic feedback from Link on how that went. But that's a kind of use case for a kind of big bang approach to migrating into SharePoint. Moving on to our next case study was with the Scottish National Investment Bank. In terms of the challenge that they had, it's actually very similar to the Lincoln Weslow challenge. Apart from it was moving from a third-party system into Office 365, and we took a very similar approach that we did for Lincoln Weslow into Scottish National Investment Bank. We had a kind of phased migration of doing an alpha migration, and then doing smaller incrementals into the Office 365. One of the other challenges that presented itself is they had a third-party document management solution that there was no easy way to kind of use a third-party tool to grab the information and pull it into SharePoint. So we had to use some kind of bespoke PowerShell, which is a scripting language, to kind of script that to pull the information and push it into SharePoint. So the migration planning, we planned that kind of big bang cutover date with smaller incrementals to kind of lead us up to that big bang, and then a cutover date on over. And again, very successful. But a key aspect is to have that planning up to that cutover stage. And again, that all went fairly successful. In terms of the tools that we used for Scottish National Investment Bank, we actually used the Microsoft's SharePoint migration tool, because there was no metadata that needed to be kind of transformed as part of the migration. We didn't need to run any reports on the kind of source side or any reports at the destination. So to kind of as the Microsoft tool was free, it was to kind of save some costs there to say, well, actually, there's no need to use the kind of more advanced features of a third-party tool. We can stick with the kind of the Microsoft offering and use that, supplemented with some PowerShell scripts for the custom document management system. Going on to our third use case is a slightly different challenge to the three, with the Scottish Prison Service. Scottish Prison Service is a lot bigger than the last two case studies. They have a SharePoint 2013 server that they have on-prem that they wanted to get rid of and migrate over to SharePoint Online. As part of that, they wanted to review their data and the structure that they've already got in 2013 and transform that into SharePoint Online. One of the biggest challenges was the actual data that they held on SharePoint 2013. It kind of been left with no kind of reviews in place of what data they had or what data should be culled. So they had a vast amount of data in there that needed to be reviewed and then brought over into SharePoint Online. Scottish Prison Service is a big company. They're about 4,000 users plus. So how we planned that migration and did that migration is we broke them down into their smaller departments and went around and engaged each department to see what data they had on their old SharePoint and how that would translate into a modern way of working into SharePoint Online. So we worked with those smaller departments, looked at what needs they had, and then built SharePoint for those departments, and then migrated the data into them. The actual migration approach we took for that was we used ShareGate. They wanted to do a fair bit of transformation in terms of their migration, so we used ShareGate to kind of pull across if they wanted any metadata kept or any other information pertaining to those files. ShareGate allows us to keep that and pull it over into SharePoint Online and also split data up to say, well, this data actually wants to go over there and that data wants to go to other parts. So you can kind of customize how that migration worked. I think overall we migrated a few terabytes of data over into SharePoint Online. And to supplement ShareGate, we also used some PowerShell scripts for some automation because there was such a vast volume of data. One person couldn't go through all, so the PowerShell scripting automation helped us kind of make that a lot quicker for us. So that's me come to the end of my slides. I'll invite people to have any questions about what we've spoken about. Feel free to pop some questions in the chat, and we can endeavour to answer them. I think there's some chat already going, so I'll leave my colleagues to carry on with that. But any questions? Anything you want us to?
Yeah, so there's a question there from Suzanne just about, she was asking, I think earlier on, about how could you create, section off sites for external users. So rather than having them as guests on your kind of organisation specific area, so rather than have them in amongst all the sites that you've created. So I'd gone back with a few options. I think she was just following up there to ask how do you section that off. So some of it depends on the use case. This one, I think some of the use cases that we've seen have been, where somebody works with, say for example, a partner organisation, and they have like a data sharing agreement with that partner. Then they'll create a site that is, for that partner, and effectively they'll put documents in there that need to be shared backwards and forwards between the two. And that would be a typical example of kind of sectioning it off for a particular use, if you like. Some other options that we see are within that kind of department structure is being able to have internal sites, but then be able to have a specific type of site, because you can create kind of site templates, which allows you to then put some kind of security around them. And that means that you can have your own department structure, but then one site that that you can share files or folders or things with externally. So it's a wee bit more of an ad hoc kind of situation. We're also seeing people use Teams for that as well. So maybe set up a team and then use that to work externally on a project, for example. And then the last option was using the sensitivity labels. So you can actually use the sensitivity labels at SharePoint or at Teams level to set whether a person can actually share with guests or share externally or not. So you could almost enforce that option too, if you like, of a department site structure where the majority are internal, but you have one site that allows that external usage as well. So there's a few options, as I'd said in the chat. I think it just really depends on the kind of use case that you're trying to do, and whether it's a permanent sharing, or whether it's project based, or whether it's just kind of ad hoc.
That's cool. George had one in the chat as well about what would be better, a few large repositories or many small ones. We're focusing on documents being available in Teams. So again, it does depend on the use case. SharePoint is, as Ollie alluded to, in the kind of permission structure of SharePoint, is they're trying to get away from having granular permissions inside a SharePoint site. So you might want to look at who actually needs access to those documents inside those repositories. Say you have, typically what we've found is if you have a big repository of data, there's probably folders in there that you'll break the permission inheritance to a certain folder and only allow a few people into that folder. So SharePoint's trying to push all these permissions to a site level. So you might want to see about splitting your documents into who needs access to them. So so for example, say you have a IT an IT site that has a big repository, you might want to split it out to say like all these IT guides that you might want everyone to have access to. So you might want to have it on a separate site so that you can give everyone access to the site, and you know that on that site everyone has access to those documents. And then create another site for say like your IT more sensitive information, and then at a site level only give people access who need that to that. It means that in terms of an overall kind of administration of the sites, you can see at an admin level who has access to those sites, and who and then you can clearly give access or remove access. Unlike if you're in a big repository of files, you have to go through the individual folders. Similar to how like NTFS permissions work, you have to kind of go into the folder and say, okay, tell me who has access to this folder. Oh, it's those people. Again, that might be different to the kind of subfolder below it. So you might be worth looking at who needs access to those files, and that might determine how you'd want to split them up into kind of smaller areas. Is a good way of thinking about it. Again, there are some overheads with larger repositories as well. SharePoint hold a huge amount of documents inside a document library, but it can only ever show 5,000 documents on the screen at once. So there's kind of some admin overheads for that as well. So typically, I would say splitting them out into smaller sections of where your permissions lie is a kind of better way of doing it, George.
Yeah, I think just to pick up on that, tying that back into the part of the question about teams as well. If you've got that split into smaller repositories, every time you effectively create a SharePoint site as a repository, if you like, so at that kind of site level that Alex is talking about, you effectively create a Microsoft 365 group for that, and then you can add a team to that Microsoft 365 group. So it kind of fits quite nicely with that. You've got a SharePoint site, that's your security boundary. You've got a team, and the members of that team, can interact in teams. They can see the documents within that SharePoint site as well. You can then obviously extend that out so that people can see different sites and teams, but that kind of one-to-one mapping works quite well at that kind of level. Okay, a question there from Craig as well. Can you explain the hub structure again? Best practice for arrangement of SharePoint sites. Ollie, do you want to pick that one up just for a bit of variety?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so yeah, hubs. Let me just get my camera back on. So essentially, I'll try and run through kind of the scenario that you'd use them. So essentially what you would do is you go into the SharePoint admin center and you'd set up specific sites. So you'd have created a series of sites in 365. You might have 10 or 20, for example. And then in that administration center, you can then essentially assign a site a hub. Now it's literally like a 2-click scenario. You just assign the hub, you can give it a name, and then that's it. That's the hub created. And then all you need to do then is select the appropriate other sites that you want associated with that hub, and you just in a kind of another 2-click scenario, you just associate with them, and that's essentially it. So in a way, it's kind of the best way to think of it is like a hub and spoke. So you've got your hub. Let's say, I'm trying to give an example, HR, and then underneath that you might have like learning and development site, for example, as an associate spoke attached to that. So and for example, if learning and development wanted to become a different move to a different department, say a big training or learning department was set up, you would create a new site for that learning department. You'd then create that as the hub, and then you could just swiftly reassociate that learning and development site with that learning hub, so within a couple of clicks. So and the way that this differs from what you had before was you'd create a site collection in SharePoint, and then you'd create a sub-site that sits underneath, and that sub-site is essentially a tree. It's directly connected to that site collection above. So that's all well and good, and it can inherit upwards permissions and all of this. But the but the problem with that is that once you try and move it, it's kind of already kind of baked into that site collection. So moving it becomes kind of quite a complicated technical exercise. So I guess the focus is on the flexibility really. Just with your second question there. So yeah, so often what we have is how do teams created SharePoint sites fit into this? Well, what you would often do is what we find to use a communication site as the hub. So kind of as like, more visual site, more information based. And then you'd often have team sites associated with that communication site. So you'd have like 4 or 5 team sites perhaps, and they'll be associated to one hub, which is a comm site. So that's the sort of scenario. It can be as formal or loose as required. Sometimes it might be just there's lots of informally created team sites, and then they're just associated with a hub just to kind of almost way to pen them in, make sure they've got some sort of management over them. But we'd probably recommend trying to organize it a bit more tightly than that. I think that's hopefully that answers your question to some extent.
So I think, Craig, just to follow up on that, is kind of a bit more focused around the navigation, and being able to kind of easily repoint and easily restructure, and the navigation changes if you like, but the site stays in the same place, and so it makes it simpler. I think for the teams created SharePoint sites, it's up to you. So there isn't a kind of pre-described structure of what gets associated with a hub. There's nothing to stop you associating a team's created SharePoint site into that hub. But I would say that very rarely happens because they tend to be more for kind of private, team-based work, if you like. There isn't really any content, if you like, that is surfaced in there, because it's just the general channel, and people drop things into the general channel. If you've extended that out in Teams and you've got a bit of a structure and you wanted other people to see that, then absolutely you could surface that as being associated to the hub. But normally we see people with Teams sites, they're kind of separate, if you like, so you can go into Teams and you see them from there, or you go into SharePoint and you see your structure down through the comm sites and kind of department team sites, if you like, fitted into there.
Just to follow up on that, because Suzanne's just put in a second question there, following up. So can a number of hubs sit under the main one, so a comm site for the organisation or department hubs with that? So yes, there is kind of a hub stacking feature, as it were. So you can have a kind of let's say an organisational top hub, and then you'd have a departmental hub sitting underneath, and they've got a parent-child relationship. So yeah, the child hubs can then look up. There's some limitations with that, so it's probably worth looking into that if you're looking into details, because there's some limited connectivity between the top hub and the child hub. It's not the same as the relationship between the associate sites and the hubs, so you need to plan that out before you start.
So those I can speak about those limitations. I've remembered them. You can have a 3 hub sites deep from the top level. You can go further. You can actually have quite a few hubs of hub sites, but the limitation is for searching. So you're wanting to mention about hubs as well is if you have your hub in the middle and you have your team sites coming off. If you do a search from the hub site, you'll be able to search across all the associated team sites you have with it that you have access to. You'll be able to search across all that content. But if you go further than 3 hubs deep in that kind of stacking structure, the search will stop and it will only go 3 deep. So that's a kind of limitation on that aspect for stacking more for that aspect. So I think with Susan, I think the main organization really for news broadcasting. So in terms, you could have a organizational hub and then have sub hubs below that of all your different departments, and then you could feed, say, your kind of news web parts up from those hub sites into the main hub, you just have to watch about how many sub hubs you go deep into that structure. So say you have a hub for the organization, and then a kind of HR hub sitting off of that, and then have like HR projects. If you do any kind of more than that, you'll have issues with if you search at the top level hub going down, it will struggle to kind of gather all the information at a hub level.
Yeah. And just to follow on with another thing, there's another thing called an organizational news site, which is a special type of hub that you can use to push through like company news from a central source. So I can stick a link into the chat, but that's a pretty good way of kind of managing full organization news, not just as a top hub. It can be pushed to multiple hub structures. Find the link for that one.
Great, thanks for all the questions. I'll hand you back to Zopash now, just to wrap up.
That's great, thank you so much. I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Graham, Alex and Ollie for delivering the presentation today. We hope you found it useful. We thank you so much for joining us. So we will be sending you a follow-up shortly, so it will have a copy of this recording and the slides as well. So if there's anything that you want to go back into and double check, you can do. If you do have any other questions, I know what it's like, you'll remember questions after the session's over, so if there is anything that you want to kind of ask, please do get in touch with us at contact us at bridgell.com. We also do have some other events coming up that you can see on our Eventbrite page. So we do have one coming up on the 15th of February, which is all around kind of Microsoft security. So if that is something that you are interested in or you might find useful, you can register for that event as well. So I'm quite aware that a lot of you might have other meetings and stuff on, so I will wrap it up now and just thank you once again, and we hope to see you at a future event. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.